Welcome back to the Entrepreneurial Edge. I'm Chris Bishop. Now you can follow us on Twitter for updates on future guests. Our handle is EntrepEdge. Plus, you can also email us on entrep@abn360.com. Now, still in the studio with me, I have Ivor Ichikowitz, the Executive Chairman of the Paramount Group, who, as we said in the first half, you deal in everything from armoured vehicles to Mirage fighters. You've got to understand, though, that the industry that you are in, it does get a bad rap. I mean, every time you pick up a newspaper, there's a headline, people dealing, weapons have ended up here, there and everywhere. How difficult is it to be in a business like this?
It's not an easy business. It is, first of all, one of the most highly regulated businesses in the world. In fact, it's probably more regulated than the banking industry. We subject ourselves to the South African arms control legislation, which is among the most some of the best structured legislation probably in the world, and probably the best policed legislation. But we subject ourselves to this because the industry is such a difficult industry, and because we have to play by the rules and be very responsible in this business. The arms industry worldwide has always had a bad rap. And it's always had a bad rap because people don't really understand the difference between the arms dealers and the arms industry. I said some time ago in an interview that calling us arms dealers is like calling the chairman of a pharmaceutical company a drug dealer. We're in the technology business. We're in the innovation business. We're in the engineering business. We're in the business of helping governments create the capability to ensure peace and stability. We're not in the weapons business, and we're not in the destroying anything business. We're in the protecting business. And unfortunately, the man in the street doesn't always understand the distinction between what we do and the stuff that gets a bad rap.
Because I think that's one of the great problems that you face. I mean, every time I pick up a newspaper, a certain time of year, you read about these arms fairs in Europe, and people say, oh, look at it, people are selling off different ways to kill, new ways to kill people, etc., etc. I mean, surely, even though you say you're nothing to do with that at all, it must rub off somehow.
It absolutely rubs off, and we deal with it every single day, and that's why we try and be as transparent as we possibly can be. The arms industry over the years, or the defense industry over the years, has had a reputation for being very cloak and dagger. And I believe that it's a business like any other business, and because of the complexity of the business, you need to be as transparent as possible. And the way we combat that is to be as transparent as we possibly can be. Now, my experience in the industry has been remarkable. I have seen with my own eyes the economic development, the social development, the growth that has occurred in countries that we've partnered with over the years. There are tangible examples of governments in Africa who have been able to create peace and stability based on the capability that we've supplied, that South Africa has supplied, that South African hands and brains and expertise has provided, that have then allowed these governments to build economic stability on top of that security. And I think that people need to understand that there is method in our madness. We do this for a reason. We don't just do this because it makes us money.
But you said that you deal with governments. I mean, how many governments in Africa do you think you've dealt with?
We've, over the years, worked with more than 25 governments in Africa. We work with governments in South America. We work with governments in Eastern Europe. We today work in the Middle East. So we are today truly a global business, and we're probably one of the, well, there are many examples, but we're one of the real visible examples of how South Africa has the skill, the expertise to become global players. But more importantly than just South Africa, Paramount, my organization, is an African company, and we're a very proudly African company, and we believe that the technology that we have and the skills that we have are assets of the African continent, not just of South Africa. And we've used those to help governments all over the world, not just in Africa.
You ever fear sometimes, though, that some of the equipment you have sold with the best intentions maybe could end up in the wrong hands? That's the way life is.
We have a very strong internal compliance capability. And our internal compliance capability helps us to determine that we're working with responsible people. And there are a lot of very responsible governments out there. And our primary activity is to resource governments with equipment that they use in fulfilling United Nations, African Union, and other international peacekeeping mandates. So the nature of the equipment that we produce is primarily for that purpose. But you know what? Into the future, we cannot take responsibility for how that equipment eventually gets used, but we do everything in our power to make sure that we're only supplying to people that have honest intentions.
And I mean, did you ever sometimes think maybe sometimes the government that you deal with may be regulated, it may be straight up and down, but sometimes they may use your weapons for, shall we say, dishonest intentions, persecuting some of their own people?
You know, the South African government handles the restriction of that very, very effectively. The National Conventional Arms Control Authority in South Africa, as I say, runs some of the most effective screening processes in the world. And you know what? All I can tell you is that in 20 years of being in this business, it's never happened yet.
And now with your business, it seems that you've gone mad. You've spread out: oil, gas, property, retail. You've spread everywhere. Is there not a problem sometimes entrepreneurs face with losing focus with
Absolutely.
this expansion?
My primary business today is my defence and aerospace business, and the growth potential in the aerospace side of our business, and we can talk a bit about that, and the land forces business is absolutely huge. So that's where my primary focus goes. But as I work in Africa, opportunities arise. And in order to accommodate those, we've established a private equity business with professional management, with the skill and the expertise that deals with that. So even though my focus is on the relationships, my focus is on securing the deals, my focus is on closing the deals, I have tremendous professional management that actually look after the implementation thereof.
And the oil and gas, I mean, I've covered many stories in the last few years on how it's growing in Africa, but it's still quite a tough business. I mean, a lot of countries are asking for a bigger share of the revenue, naturally, and it's a very slow process for negotiations. How are you finding it?
The oil and gas business in Africa is one of the biggest curses this continent faces, as well as one of the biggest opportunities. And we're in the oil and gas business because we believe that African governments are entitled to a bigger share. We believe that the oil majors have to start giving a little bit back. And through the work that we're doing, both in the mining sector as well as in the oil and gas industry, we're working with governments to create very unique structures to put control, or put more control of these assets back into the hands of these governments and back into the hands of local capability. So we see huge growth and huge opportunity, but you're quite right, it's a difficult business, and it's certainly not a business for sissies.
I mean, another journalist colleague of mine said these days, if you find any sort of oil or gas anywhere, as soon as you start looking for it, you'll find people coming saying, "Excuse me, this is our land, this is our government, we want to get some sort of wealth from this."
This doesn't only happen in Africa. If
Yes.
you look at what's happening in South America today,
Venezuela, yes,
and in
absolutely.
Eastern Europe,
Sure.
and you know what? The world is changing. The days when major multinationals could come in and plunder African resources are over. And if I have any mission in life, it is to make sure that there is a fair relationship between African governments and the technical partners that they choose. And the relationship needs to be good for both sides, and it hasn't always been in the past.
As an entrepreneur, are you prepared to go to your shareholders and say, "Listen, you're only going to get half the dividend this year because we're playing fair with Uganda, Kenya, whoever"? Are you prepared to do that as an entrepreneur?
Absolutely. Because I know that if I don't do that, then I will do one deal and I won't do the next deal and the next deal and the next deal. As I said earlier, you know, if I were to look at my career and my training as an entrepreneur, which I have had none, by the way, the most important teaching is that the relationship is everything. And a relationship endures if everybody's happy in the relationship. And if one side wins and the other one loses, then the relationship is not going to endure.
Would you describe yourself as ruthless in business?
No. I think that thanks to my father and thanks to the upbringing that I had, I'm probably a lot less ruthless than I should be. And I think that my approach to business is that everything that I do has to have a positive outcome, not just for me.
It's funny, the previous guest, a lot of people I spoke to described him as ruthless, and he looked at me when I said that and he said, "Oh, you're the first person who's ever said that to me." So it's just funny how people perceive people. But also you're something of a philanthropist as well. In the past you've invested heavily in sports, that sort of stuff.
What we do in our foundation is really a continuation of my philosophy on how the developing world should be developing. And I'm very passionate about South Africa and very passionate about the role that the South African experience can play in educating other experiences around the world. So our foundation funds something called the African Oral History Archive, which is a very, very fascinating project that captures oral history of recent, or oral testimony of recent African and South African stories. And in the work that we do, we discovered that there's an anomaly in South Africa. Black and white South Africans have learned to do business together, they've learned to do politics together, but they don't do leisure time together. So Robert Gumede, my partner, and myself went out to look for a platform that would allow South Africans to do leisure time together. And rugby was the perfect platform.
The famous World Cup, sorry.
Absolutely.
And do you remember where you were on that day when they won it for the first time, 95?
I absolutely do. I had a pair of tickets and I gave them to my parents. My father is an absolute rugby fanatic and my mother and my father were at the World Cup and I watched on television and it was one of the proudest days of my life.
And you've invested very recently in the Lions team here in Johannesburg.
The Lions experience is one of the saddest experiences of my life. Because we went into rugby because we really felt that the time had come to transform rugby as a sport and turn it into a true South African sport, a sport that was something that both black and white South Africans could properly identify with. And we thought the Lions would be the perfect vehicle. Unfortunately, because of the legacy of the past and many kind of deep ingrained prejudices, that wasn't possible, and we very quickly withdrew from the Lions transaction simply because we saw that it might have been good business at the end of the day, but it wasn't going to achieve our objective. But we haven't left rugby forever, and we're certainly looking at other opportunities to achieve the same objective.
So finally, very briefly, you might be going back into rugby sometime soon.
Well, we're looking at a number of options, and it's probably far too soon to be able to make any announcements. But there's some interesting things on the cards.
Yeah, we'll watch the newspapers. So Ivor Ichikowitz, the Executive Chairman of Paramount Group, thank you very much for your time and your fantastic story which you shared with us today. So that's a wrap of this week's Entrepreneurial Edge. Tune in again the same time next week. Until then, from me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.